You know, I never noticed how beautiful this pond was before. So calm. The world can be like that, so calm on the outside, as if nothing bad ever happens. Ow! What the hell are you doing, Cartman?
I'm killing you, but unfortunately I could only afford a wiffle bat, so it's gonna take a while.
Cartman!
Don't fight it, Kyle. It will only take longer. Just slip into sweet unconsciousness.
I can finally see its beauty. The lush blue fields, the crystal clear waters, the wind brushing past my... God, this
contradicts.
Yeah, obviously Breath of the Wild has this, and just as obviously, we need to expand on this. I think what they mean here is a serene and beautiful bit of nature. As such, I think we could partially combine this with point 6, vast fields, forests, and mountain peaks, as it brings up the variety of terrain, which can all be serene. And if the serene nature is not what they meant, this is still a major problem with the environmental storytelling in the world overall, so let's finish that topic off now. So yeah, even I can agree that Breath of the Wild has some nice vistas and little thickets of nature. It certainly does feel serene a lot, like looking over Mayan ruins lost to time and reclaimed by the jungle, or homes from the 1800s in Western America abandoned and smothered in trees once more. I've gone into this topic before and touched upon aspects of the serene nature in previous parts. Mechanically, as shown with uninterrupted downtime, the game does have aspects that, as well as supporting freedom, can be used to help sell the serene nature, such as enemies being so easy to avoid or stepping away when they first pop up. The lack of music could also be relaxing to just give you nature sounds if you like that, and being able to climb anywhere lets you not be challenged by the terrain. The freedom to do what you want when you want allows for you to choose your level of engagement in anything, so you can restrict yourself to only the things that interest and thus relax you. Even the deterministic shrines or Korok seeds or combat could be argued to be supporting the serene nature, since after a few hours in, you're not really challenged by it, or at least after the first few attempts at anything new. And there's no punishment for you not doing something. You can easily just walk in any direction and see nice scenery, letting you discover things at your own pace, without any stress or challenge. But that's kind of the opposite of what you should have in a post-apocalypse. The serene nature in post-apocalypse are inherently contradictory. And as much as our resident madam adds a nice variant of voice, the lady of the house is actually on vacation, so I shall be playing the part of quote reader. Inner contradictions are at the heart of any bad design. If a device is supposed to make my life easier and it is hard to use, that is a contradiction. If something is supposed to be fun and it is boring or frustrating, that is a contradiction. A good designer must carefully remove inner contradictions and not get used to them or make excuses for them. Fallout New Vegas' Vault 22 is a wasteland of plants, since the vault was created to test new plant species. Naturally, since we can't have nice things, rather than a super potato, we got plant zombies, which shows nature retaking the vault while keeping the post-apocalypse theme. In Horizon Zero Dawn, the beauty of nature side by side with the ruins isn't a contradiction, because we're so far removed from the apocalypse that the beautiful land is supposed to symbolize how our world is over. And the plot even goes into why it's important for nature to regrow once more. Those ruins do affect the plot, but many are just set dressing to the events of the story now. But Breath of the Wild is supposed to be only 100 years after the calamity, which was supposedly right next door to the other major cities. Every map should have sections of beauty, even post-apocalypses, to emphasize what was and what could be again among the horrors and degradation after the apocalypse. Don't get me wrong, I remember the quotes I briefly mentioned at the end of part 3.0 talking about aesthetic enjoyment. I'm not saying having a pretty landscape isn't a reward in and of itself, but it can't be the whole map. If you're trying to sell a land that's been ravaged by a world-ending calamity, it kind of drives home the counterpoint that this world is perfectly fine, so why fight to change it back? Is that just rooted in our modern romantic knowledge that nature is better than capitalist industry? Maybe, but a game designer needs to be aware of the mindset of their audience. Let's take yet another look at Fallout in A Link Between Worlds. In both of these, we have lands that were once great, but have fallen into disrepair through either a single moment of destruction or a slow decline. Fallout is the poster child here. Grimy green and brown landscapes, radiated dumps, it's not a pretty place.
This is the ugliest effing skirt I've ever seen.
Even Fallout 4, the nicest looking one so far, is still gray, muted, rusted, and worn out to sell a ruined world. But we have some moments of natural beauty, and we can argue that people making cities and working to make the world livable is the game's beauty in contrast to the ruins. Plus, there is a foundation in what America looks like now, or what the 1950s looked like, so it can cheap out a bit on showing us the world before the bombs. Lorule is more more colorful, but it leans more into the classic haunted house and spooky vibe, with skulls and more powerful monsters, which is still a contrast to Hyrule. The people are mean and reclusive, more distrusting and bitter, fitting for their world, which we see from the very first person there, who's a contrast to the person we meet at the beginning of the game. The entirety of Lorule, unsurprisingly, contrasts the Hyrule we were exploring earlier in the game with its nice people and easier enemies. Heck, the first time I went to Lorule, no kidding, the first enemy killed me. What better way to show the player this place is worse off? You have ghosts in the town that was a quaint little village which is now ruins. These used to be houses, and we can swap to Hyrule and see how they may have been before Lorule's decline, rather than just saying this was a town and leaving. And despite the ruins and the decline happening over time, people still live in this town because there's like nowhere else to go, and we see the apocalypse is still affecting the world and the people. We have something so small as the chicken coop being broken and the cuckoos, cuckoos? I don't know, I'm just gonna call them cuckoos, are running around homeless, and this poor lady feels bad about it. She's caring for a single egg, swearing to keep it safe and nurse it to adulthood since the parents can't anymore. That's actually really sad. We see what the world could have been by exploring Hyrule and see someone clinging to a remnant of hope and humanity in a land that is clearly worse off. If both Lorule and the wasteland of Fallout were full of splendid green fields and lush forests and beautiful vistas, would it sell how broken these places were, that there were ruined post-apocalypse we should fight to reverse? No, there would be no narrative tension. See upcoming story video for further breakdowns there, because there'd be no active villain, be it an actual person who runs in to ruin the Serene Nature, or the continuous march towards decay. Either of those would fit into a post-apocalypse, but not a serene hiking game that cannot drive the players towards actually fixing the world, because then they might not feel complete freedom to do whatever they want, however they want, whenever they want. Yes, Zelda is keeping Ganon locked up and the monsters keep respawning, but we don't get anything to say us spending 40 hours finding Korok seeds is taking too long, or like how I spoke about the monsters aren't actually an issue to the people in this world. Plus we can instantly skip the Blood Moon cutscenes anyways, so you know, it doesn't really feel like a problem after it happens the first few times. It just becomes rote, something to be expected. Having a villain or any kind of tension to make us want to fix the world would be at odds with the Serene Nature message. We'd be like, are you sure this land is destroyed? It looks pretty great. Nothing seems wrong. In fact, it honestly looks nicer than much of the world in which we currently live. And honestly, Breath of the Wild's not even that pretty. The lighting hard carries it. But if you just enjoy looking at Breath of the Wild, that's not something I can argue against. Aesthetic enjoyment is a big part of rewards, and multiple other chapters in all of my textbooks say that being pretty is a good thing, even if it shouldn't be the only focus, since that makes a game shallow. I've touched on that before, but let me just put up a few more chapters and citations here so no one's like, oh, you just don't think games should be pretty. They can and should try to look good, but not when it becomes an issue. I do think other games look better, but as I said in part 1, there's no right or wrong answer on what's fun, only on if something is well designed or not to be fun. I mean, it's not like I can't appreciate how some people just enjoy looking at the scenery of the game they find nice. For example, if you like abstract or absurdist art and I prefer more rigid displays of cubism, that's not really something we can debate, but we can tell if a portrait done in those styles is a well done portrait, since you still have to show a person in a portrait. I think the auroras in Skyrim and Monster Hunter World are prettier, but that could just be a decision between basic cell shading art or realistic art, which is where I'll have to leave that opinion for the sake of objectivity. And this is also going to be true for other aspects of like the art design overall, unfortunately, such as like deep color theory beyond having contrast to break up character design. I can't really break that down, as well as other theory on game design, and I want to keep this study as objective as possible. It looks to me like other games are clearly doing this better, but I can't really cite many specific theories on that. Perhaps someone with more of a training in art and actual art design can let me know, and I can give Breath of the Wild some points or not for like if the colors are a balanced palette. I could say like a character's design is too busy or contrasting with how a character is presented, or like if a landscape isn't filled with enough crags to sell a Badlands and it's just a flat plain, but that's really about it. So I won't really be going too far into the art design principles of this objective breakdown, since that will require me to be basically learning how to draw, and since I'm still on stick figures.
Oh, geez, mine doesn't look anything like his. To hell with it.
so chalk this up like the technical issues where I can't say whether my copy actually has the same issues as others. However, while some aspects of the Serene Nature are rooted in the art design, like if the grass itself is well animated, if a panning shot of a forest is pretty, and if the characters are drawn with good lines of action beyond what the layman can see, their inclusion affects other aspects of the game itself, so regardless of their objective quality, what they do to the rest of the design is basically separate from their construction. Remember that for the music section. Anyways, back to clashing themes. Remember my single theme quote from the start of part 2? Here it is in case you don't. Just like how a story should be focused on something, regardless of its delivery method, like around the main character's conflict with an antagonist, or a single message, or an exploration of a time period. A game should build itself around a single theme. Breath of the Wild does that from a mechanical standpoint with its freedom, although you could argue that aspects of that freedom support the Serene Nature theme. But it doesn't do that with its world design and narrative. Skyrim's world design is built around the theme of a Nordic land. You have birch forests, fjords, tundras, rocky crags, plains, marshes, all locations you can expect to see on a walking tour of Scandinavian countries. It follows that theme with the placement of specifically separate people, like the orcs living in different towns to sell their other status within the province of Skyrim. While there are elves and Argonians throughout Skyrim, they're clearly in Skyrim because of the connectedness of the Empire, and the Nords are still clearly the majority in Skyrim cities, sometimes having the other races in specific segregated areas. Those orcs still use the same 3D model of a forge, which hurts their other status, I guess you could argue, but you could say that this makes sense since if they live in Skyrim, well, they're going to be using similar things to the locals, right? In point 6, I go into whether it's better to stick to a video gamey Mario kind of idea of having desert, jungle, tundra, and volcanoes all next to each other, but still it comes down to what you're trying to sell. In a game with a more realistic art style, that would be jarring, and it would be just as jarring in a game that's supposed to be a ruined world to then craft itself as some place that's also consistently beautiful and serene. There's no single theme for Breath of the Wild to follow like in Fallout. I mean, the ruined world is literally the first thing Makoto Yonzu said they wanted to make for Breath of the Wild. It's also the entire point of the plot, so the game has two themes, a serene nature and a very recent apocalypse that are both at direct odds with each other. So even though I said Horizon's world gets a pass because the ruined world isn't the focal point, let's be fair and look at its descriptions like we're doing for Breath of the Wild. In an era where machines roam the land and mankind is no longer the dominant species, a young hunter named Aloy embarks on a journey to discover her destiny. In a lush, post-apocalyptic world, where nature has reclaimed the ruins of a forgotten civilization, pockets of humanity live on in primitive hunter-gatherer tribes. Their dominion over the new wilderness has been usurped by the machines, fearsome, mechanical creatures of unknown origin. It's clear that enough time has passed in the game's story that people don't know what the heck a McDonald's was, and reverted from our Western European capitalist civilization to scattered and primitive tribes, or at least vaguely medieval. There are no more people who saw the destruction firsthand. It's not even a post-apocalypse in the same vein as Fallout, which takes place hundreds of years after the bombs fell but still has remnants of the old world playing a role in the story, like the Brotherhood of Steel. Horizon is so long after the apocalypse that it makes sense for the world to be designed with more beauty with the occasional ruin. The satellite array is completely run down and forgotten, but we know what it was because this is Earth, and it adds to the story of the characters to go, what's this? And we say, a freaking satellite dish, you dork. It's logical and believable for the world, adding story and context, helping us identify with this new world, giving insights into how people think about specific areas of the game now, and selling how distant our world and the apocalypse that ended it is to these people. We can have lush, beautiful forests and wonderful vistas everywhere because this is a game selling itself as a world where enough time has passed for the ruins to be forgotten and reclaimed, even if we still understand what the heck that apocalypse was, which is rooted in our understanding of our own world. But Breath of the Wild's calamity was so recent in the story that there are still people around who survived it. So trying to act like there's so much of this world that's been lost to time, so it's fine if nature has retaken it all, makes no sense. Did Impa just not tell anyone what happened? What the shrines were? How to kill guardians? Anything? How about Pura and Robbie? The Zora still remember Mifa firsthand because they were there. If so many of the people in Hyrule weren't alive during the collapse, then they would have heard about it from their parents or grandparents. How come this information wasn't spread out? Why is no one trying to organize resistance to Ganon since he's still locked up and the Bokoblins are leaderless, or send occasional Sheikah agents to keep an eye on Link's tomb? If they're scared that maybe posting like a guard 24/7 Ganon would be too obvious. But then again, Zelda is holding Ganon back, so who cares? I mean, the world is fine enough for someone to travel around circulating a newspaper that wonders if dragons exist, as if they can't literally be seen from miles away in any of the major cities. Why is information unable to travel if the world is serene and calm, so people clearly don't have trouble traveling? We can't use like a lack of information to sell the ruined world in the same vein as like Horizons that is completely moved on. It doesn't justify the serene nature, it's just incongruous. That would be like the Romans in Constantinople forgetting that Rome existed when Justinian took the throne. It would be like the nukes in Fallout went off, but the world looked beautiful and the Enclave just forgot the United States existed after 100 years and John Henry Eden was still there. That wouldn't really be an irradiated hellscape struggling to move on from the bombs that still define the world. If a group is very casual and feels counting cards or diving for the ball is not really worth it, a new player who wants a relaxed game will be content. If the group counts cards on a regular basis, the new player may feel obligated to do the same. Even if he does not, he may suffer increased downtime from the players who do, decreased chances of winning, and a generally less relaxed atmosphere. The group is pushing him towards an escalated level of play that is less enjoyable than the more casual experience would be. If the new player is instead more serious than the group, she may be encouraged to relax or take it easy as a group tries to preserve the style of play they enjoy and to avoid having to engage in what they see as unpleasant activities just to stay at the same level of winning. These two modes of playing are irreconcilable, where Breath of the Wild is seemingly encouraging both its serene nature and the implications of its ruined world, not to mention all other Zelda games not being casual, relaxing games, but you can lump that in with the overall cost of the effort to reward ratio. It's the same problem as those two trailers I brought up before. Breath of the Wild can't decide on what it wants to be. If it just wanted to be a wandering game, fine. But it's stuck between two worlds and both end up suffering as a result. We don't get the emotional impact of a post-apocalypse, seeing what it's become of Hyrule with more stories and characters like Fallout, or have harder combat to sell a more dangerous world like with Dark Souls. I do believe that the Serene Nature feel is mostly well designed, with increased downtime and busy work and enemies that move away and everything I've said before. But as I said before, the game advertised itself as, very generously speaking, half relaxing and half not, which I don't really agree with, but it's the best way of looking at it. If we want to conclude that Breath of the Wild gets a perfect 10 out of 10 for its relaxing side, then it does not get a 10 out of 10 for its post-apocalypse side, or vice versa, and thus is not a 10 out of 10 game, and thus is poorly designed. You don't win the archery competition because you aimed for the bullseye, missed, but the target just happened to fall at that moment, so you got the bullseye anyways. If the game decided to fully embrace its serene side, then it could focus on that theme and expand. Here, we don't get a full serene experience where we get fully programmed animal AI, or nicer water whose path we can follow, and see a full forest naturally springing up around it like, you know, going to a park, or Animal Crossing, since, you know, just all of that is a serene game that fails at what it wants to be because we end up wanting to murder every sea bass we find. You've only got one plate, and if you try to feed two people off of it, neither are gonna be full. So check two, yes, kind of, but at what cost? It ruins the main theme of the story, unlike other post-apocalypse games, instead of selling the ruined world, while making the effort to reward ratio worse, as I mentioned before, and failing to fully embrace either side. There are a few other tiny factors that make the Serene Nature even worse, such as like the music, but I'll be bringing them up a bit later in a following video, so again, feel free to add them here if you don't think I made the X thick enough.
Is today's hectic lifestyle making you tense and impatient?
Shut up and get to the point!
Then come relive the carefree days of yore at Pastorama, where old New York comes alive.
It's like stepping back into the year 2000.
Time for the mammoth hunt, dudes!
Alright, to dissect this one, let's define the anchoring effect. This will be important later when we break up why the divine beasts and shrines don't actually add anything or have any narrative impact. Harvard Law School describes the anchoring effect as a cognitive bias that describes the common human tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information offered, the anchor, when making decisions. During decision-making, anchoring occurs when individuals use an initial piece of information to make subsequent judgments. Once an anchor is set, the other judgments are made by adjusting away from that anchor, and there is a bias towards interpreting other information around that anchor. Since I, in the game itself, established, and will continue to establish, that we shouldn't look at Breath of the Wild through the lens of other Zelda games, even though it's still kind of disingenuous to call itself Zelda, and the world is not ruined, as I showed, the anchor I'm referring to is the idea of what a medieval life is like. I'm using medieval broadly here, since, Hyrule proper has some heavy medieval European style, while the Sheikah are Japanese and the Gerudo are kind of like an amalgamation of some desert cultures. Still, when we think of life in the past, especially to a time like what Hyrule seems to be set in, what do we see? Kings and queens, shoguns and shahs, knights clashing on the fields of battle, farmers and serfs.
Now we see the violence inherent in the system.
Traders and merchants, builders and textile weavers, etc. That was life then. It was life for almost all of our settled existence as humans, and is kind of basically life now, but with different names, but I'm digressing again. You can use this anchor for plenty of fantasy stories. We're gonna see a magical and exaggerated world based on our historical or mythological traditions, even if it's also based on a previous work of fiction, since at some point that fiction was based on those two things, or takes general cultural influence with maybe some monsters and wizards and etc. When we see a world in a fantasy setting, we come from that anchor. So, no, this world isn't rustic. It's normal. I mean, okay, technically by the dictionary definition, it's rustic, but that shouldn't be how low of a bar we have to clear. This is what we expect to see in a fantasy or just plain medieval setting. The Witcher 3 isn't specifically rustic. The villages outside of Novigrad are, and neither is Skyrim. We see dye makers, farmers, traders, textile manufacturers, rulers, a normal fantasy setting. The only thing that's rustic are the smaller, crappier villages outside the larger cosmopolitan cities. The whole world is not rustic, and it doesn't get praise for that. But Fallout as a whole is rustic because it's partially drawing off of our world and the fact that the world was previously ruined, so people have regressed to scratching out a living in the rubble. We know what a 1950s America was like. We're shown plenty of images and specific stories or locations about what the world was like beforehand, and we see remnants of it with robots that still function during the game. We can easily imagine what a ruined house was before the bombs fell based on common sense, because this is a sci-fi universe that is based off of America's 1950s with real locations and what we see in other parts of the game. It shows how life has degraded from a point we can identify beyond the basics of this was a house and now it's broken. Fallout went from prosperous to ruined, and the people there are living however they can. That is rustic. Everywhere but the center field of Breath of the Wild is totally normal based on our anchor. The game didn't give us the anchor of what the past looked like, so we have to go off of the medieval one we already have. Or, we can just look at the art book that says nowhere but the center was ruined, but as I said, nobody's in a worse place because of that destruction, so how is this a rustic world? It's only rustic in comparison to our life now, and we don't praise other fantasy stories for showing a rustic life. It's just an expected depiction of the life of a person in a fantasy story. As for the survivors bit, the center of Hyrule was obliterated and most of the survivors of that fled to Hateno village, I think. I swear to God I heard this once, but I genuinely can't find someone saying so in my footage or find a reference for that online or in the art book. But even if no one from the center made it there, which is kind of weird because it's one of the only two defendable settlements, so, where else would people run? Or maybe they all just got obliterated by the Guardians because they were so fast and powerful, even though, they didn't seem powerful enough to, get over a wall. Still, something like that should be the major story point and form the basic foundation of Hateno Village from a narrative level, being the paranoid survivors of Hyrule, the last airbender of their kingdom. Even without the remnants of the Hylians fleeing there, it makes sense for them to feel that way since they would have been the last settlement of Hyrule, except, Lorraine Village is Hylian, but then we could still have conflict between them for who takes up the mantle, or Hateno decides they don't count, or we can learn that Lorraine was originally autonomous or something like that. That would be a contrast to the other races in the game who weren't directly hit like the Hylians were, and make the Hylians feel like actual survivors. Yet neither Hateno or Lorraine don't seem to be suffering from the destruction of their central authority, so are they actually survivors? No, nothing is broken and everyone is fine, as I broke down in my Ruined World check. We don't see any conflict between Hateno's original inhabitants and the survivors for the overcrowded or undersupplied city who can't support this influx of people due to the loss of their main kingdom and the breakdown in trade, and how much more dangerous the world has become since it's ruined. I don't know, heck, maybe that already happened in survivors went and made their own town or massacred the original inhabitants or, whatever fits a younger demographic. However it happened, whether there were survivors from the center fleeing to Hateno or not, everything being fine as if nothing happened shows that nobody here is a survivor. Either way, having that would clash with the serene nature of the game. However, we do see like 2 people who are like actual survivors who then, didn't pass on the knowledge of what happened or how to defeat Ganon or anything. They saw Ganon's destruction firsthand and yet decided to just sit and wait for Link to arrive, as did the Zora. Both of them and Impa with Sheikah could conceivably organize some kind of resistance to Ganon. Nobody says they have to march in and kick his ass, but like they could do something. Plus, it's not really made clear why the king can't like leave the plateau, and if he can't, like, why didn't he tell Link to tell his people that he's still a spirit and like rally them to help? Like, he can have an entire like shed built for himself, or at least like actually interact with the world, so like he's basically alive and immortal. So like, why not go say your king is still alive? Let's get together and work on this. We see this check butting against the contradictions quote I brought up earlier, while relying on the game being a ruined world, which it clearly isn't, as I showed. So, is this Rustic? No, the people living totally normal fantasy/medieval lives that we see in multiple other fantasy stories and our own history. We can't claim that anyone is really a survivor because we're shown nothing to infer that things were better beforehand, as every location doesn't seem to have any issue besides minor problems, aren't enough of a danger to shut anything down, or aren't an issue that the people would presumably have safeguards against. But more on that in the story video, especially when the art book confirms that nothing but the center field was destroyed. Maybe the survivors who were in the center field moved to Hateno, but oh no, you moved from Chicago to New York, didn't change your job, and don't bring up why you moved, and it didn't seem to affect anything in your life or cause any issues, so did your life really change that much?
In my time, we didn't depend on high-tech gadgets like you do. We didn't need a mechanical washing unit to wash our clothes. We just used a washing machine. And look, you don't need an electric can opener to feed yourself. All you need is a trusty Swiss Army knife. Ow! I'm hungry.
I'd say this is exactly the same as my previous check. What we have in Breath of the Wild is no different from what we expect. We see nothing to show these people's lives have changed. The world isn't ruined except for like the center, and nobody seems in the least bit worse for wear, as the art book explains. So check 4, no.
Here, the babies lose their pajama-like coat after their first year. Isn't that interesting, honey?
Yep. Mind-numbingly interesting.
Okay, all you but that's subjective, or you're saying I can't like the game commenters who still haven't heard my countless clarifications. Here you go. This is for you. I talked about the ruined world not being ruined and not telling us anything, and I'll be circling back to some of those points with the upcoming big places. The serene nature is nice, but is detrimental to the game's themes and exacerbates mechanical issues with uninterrupted downtime and meaningless rewards and deterministic busy work on top of everything else I explained in part 2. The normal people aren't doing anything to sell this world as something different or affected by some sort of super calamity, so they're just living normal lives and not rustic ones. Yeah, that's not very interesting. However, that is subjective. I kinda hate saying that because I want this series to help show that you can be objective about art, since so many people forget that we have schools and degrees and rules and conventions for all types of art for a reason. Like I said over and over, even if, they're not sacrosanct. But maybe you do find Breath of the Wild's world interesting. I could and will break down yet more things like the narrative having no tension or those dragons being a joke and such. However, this point is more like saying I had fun, and I said way back in my intro,
but still, if you enjoyed Breath of the Wild, that's great. This isn't human rights. There's no wrong answer. If you genuinely enjoyed yourself with this game, I can't say you're wrong because you, in fact, did enjoy yourself. Because there's no right or wrong answer on what's fun.
Heck, I love museums, but plenty of people would rather eat their own eyelids than stare at yet another shard of pottery in a glass case. I can't give this a check or not. I've shown and will continue to show that Breath of the Wild is a badly designed game and many other games are better. But my favorite movie of all time is objective trash, so what interests you is subjective. Whatever. Close enough. Alright, and be sure to work on your dreams because you can't do it, whatever it is. Right, almost forgot.